This is the most beautiful acoustic guitar you have ever seen. A Gibson Custom Shop SJ200.
What's it worth?
It's an expensive guitar, man.
I mean, what's your best price on it?
I can do 90.
I'll give you 85.
I've got to have 90.
Okay. Change your mind, call me.
85, man.
There are moments inside a pawn shop that last only a few seconds. Moments when years of experience collide with something that refuses to fit any familiar pattern. On an ordinary morning in Las Vegas, a man walked through the doors carrying an old guitar case. Nothing about him demanded attention. He wasn't dressed like a collector. He wasn't surrounded by cameras or assistants. He didn't speak with the confidence of someone trying to impress strangers. He simply carried the case with extraordinary care. That detail mattered, because people who own expensive things often show them off. People who carry history protect it. What happened over the next few hours would become one of the most fascinating stories ever associated with Pawn Stars. Not because of the money, not because of the negotiation, but because it forced everyone involved to confront a question that extends far beyond guitars. How do you place a price on something whose greatest value cannot yet be proven? This isn't really a story about $1 million instrument. It's a story about memory, about patience, about the dangerous difference between what can be verified today and what may become undeniable tomorrow. Stay with us, because the most valuable part of this guitar wasn't made from mahogany, maple, or steel strings. It was hidden inside a story that almost disappeared forever. The man standing across from Rick Harrison had spent most of his life avoiding attention. He had never become a celebrity. He never sold out arenas. Most people had never heard his name. Yet for decades, his fingerprints quietly existed on recordings that millions of people had listened to without ever realizing who was playing. He had worked as a session musician during the 1970s, a time when Nashville studios operated with relentless discipline. Session players weren't hired because they were famous. They were hired because they could walk into a recording session, hear a song once, perform it perfectly, and leave before dinner. It demanded precision. It demanded humility. And above all, it demanded consistency. While stars collected awards and magazine covers, musicians like him built the invisible foundation underneath their success. For more than 40 albums, he had done exactly that. Then, quietly, he retired. No farewell tour, no headlines, just another working musician closing one chapter of life. Through every move, every change of address, every difficult season, one possession always traveled with him. A single guitar. It had lived inside a humidity-controlled case for more than 3 decades. He rarely played it anymore. He never displayed it. Friends knew he owned something special, but very few had ever seen it. Even more surprising, he had never insured it. He had never commissioned a formal appraisal. His belief in its value rested almost entirely on a conversation that had taken place decades earlier. Back in 1991, he had shown the instrument to a respected vintage guitar dealer. The dealer examined it carefully, turned it over in his hands, studied every detail. Finally, he looked back at the owner and quietly said that the guitar could someday be worth well into 6 figures, possibly much more. There was no official paperwork, no written valuation, no certificate, only the memory of that conversation, and a handwritten note folded neatly inside the guitar case. Years later, that dealer passed away. His opinion survived only through the seller's memory. Think about that for a moment. How many valuable things in this world exist without perfect documentation? How many family heirlooms, old photographs, letters, musical instruments carry stories that future generations struggle to prove? Sometimes history survives only because someone refuses to let go. If you've ever inherited something whose meaning mattered more than its price, tell us about it in the comments. Those stories deserve to be remembered. When the seller finally placed the worn guitar case onto the counter inside Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, Rick Harrison reacted exactly as decades in business had trained him to react. Calmly, professionally, skeptically. After more than 30 years buying and selling unusual objects, Rick understood a simple truth. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Every week, people walked through those doors convinced they owned priceless treasures. Most were wrong. Some had been misled. Others simply hoped optimism might increase an offer. The staff had learned to recognize the signs long before an item was even examined. An unusually high asking price. A story that's difficult to verify. Limited paperwork. Those ingredients often led to disappointment. This situation appeared no different. When Rick asked the obvious question, "What are you looking to get?" the seller answered without hesitation, $1 million. There was no dramatic pause, no attempt to soften the number. He simply stated it as though it were obvious. For a brief moment, even Rick seemed surprised. Not because expensive guitars were unusual. He had handled valuable instruments before. But because asking 7 figures inside a pawn shop required absolute confidence. Rick looked at the case, then back at its owner. What makes it worth that? The answer wasn't loud. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't designed to impress anyone watching television. Instead, the seller spoke almost like someone explaining a family memory. He believed the guitar wasn't merely rare. He believed it had lived an extraordinary life before it ever reached his hands. That difference changed everything. Because collectors don't simply buy objects. They buy stories. And sometimes, a story is worth far more than the object carrying it. Rick knew exactly what needed to happen next. Before discussing another dollar, before touching a string or examining a finish, one question had to be answered. Was the guitar itself authentic? Only then could anyone begin asking the much harder question. Was its history real? As the old case slowly opened, the atmosphere inside the shop changed in a way cameras rarely capture. Nobody spoke. Nobody rushed. Even experienced employees instinctively leaned closer. Inside rested a guitar that, at first glance, looked beautiful. But to experts, beauty wasn't the remarkable part. Recognition was. Within seconds, Rick understood he wasn't looking at an ordinary vintage instrument. He might be looking at one of the rarest guitars ever built. And if that first impression proved true, the million-dollar question was only just beginning. The expert arrived less than an hour later, carrying no fanfare and making no dramatic entrance. He didn't need one. In the world of vintage instruments, reputation isn't built on television appearances. It's built on being right when hundreds of thousands of dollars depend on your judgment. Before saying a single word about value, he asked for better lighting. The guitar was carefully removed from its case and placed on a clean inspection table. Cotton gloves remained untouched. Contrary to popular belief, experienced authenticators often prefer clean, bare hands because gloves can reduce sensitivity and increase the risk of accidental slips. Every movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The room had grown unusually quiet. Rick watched from across the table without interrupting. Years in the pawn business had taught him something important. When a true specialist is working, silence is often more valuable than conversation. The examination began with the serial number. Then the neck, the truss rod cavity, the maple top, the mahogany body. Every screw, every solder joint, every tiny imperfection was treated as evidence. Original 1959 Gibson Les Paul standards possess characteristics that counterfeiters spend decades trying and failing to duplicate. Tool marks hidden beneath hardware. Aging patterns impossible to manufacture naturally. Tiny production inconsistencies created by craftsmen who never imagined their work would one day be analyzed under magnification. One by one, those details aligned. Nothing appeared altered. Nothing suggested replacement. Nothing raised immediate suspicion. Finally, the expert looked up. The guitar is authentic. For a moment, nobody spoke. That single sentence transformed everything. Only minutes earlier, the possibility still existed that the instrument might be an elaborate reproduction. Now, it had officially entered one of the most exclusive categories in the vintage guitar world. A genuine 1959 Gibson Les Paul standard. Collectors often describe these guitars as the Stradivarius of electric guitars, not simply because they're rare, but because they represent a perfect intersection of craftsmanship, timing, and cultural history. Only a limited number left the Gibson factory during that production year. Many were modified during the decades that followed. Others disappeared into private collections, were damaged beyond repair, or simply vanished from documented history. Finding an untouched example had become extraordinarily uncommon. Yet authentication solved only half the mystery. The much bigger question remained untouched. Who had played it? The seller had hinted from the very beginning that this wasn't merely a rare Gibson. He believed the instrument had once belonged to a legendary British rock guitarist during a major American tour in the early 1970s. If that claim could be proven, the guitar's value would no longer depend solely on rarity. It would become part of music history itself. The expert turned his attention toward the evidence the seller had carefully preserved over decades. First came the folded handwritten note from the deceased vintage dealer. Interesting, but not proof. Next came an old repair receipt from Memphis dated September 1972. Again, interesting. The date matched the era described by the seller. The type of repair suggested extensive professional use rather than casual ownership. Still, not proof. Then came a faded black and white photograph. The image showed a guitarist standing beneath concert lights with what appeared to be an almost identical Les Paul. The finish looked right. The hardware looked right. Even the wear patterns seemed similar. But photographs deceive. Lighting changes colors. Camera angles distort proportions. An identical-looking guitar isn't necessarily the same guitar. Once again, interesting, not proof. Finally, attention shifted toward faint markings near the headstock. Small identification labels, almost invisible after decades of careful handling. Road crews in the early 1970s often marked equipment to prevent instruments from being confused while traveling between cities. Those markings resembled authentic touring labels. Yet resemblance alone couldn't establish ownership. The expert leaned back in his chair. 3 independent clues. 3 pieces of a puzzle. Every one of them pointed toward the same story. Yet none of them could legally confirm it. That distinction frustrated everyone in the room, especially the seller, because from his perspective, history rarely survives in perfect condition. Musicians lose paperwork. Managers retire. Road crews pass away. Studios close. Storage boxes disappear. If every historical object required flawless documentation to matter, countless pieces of cultural history would simply cease to exist. Rick understood that argument. He genuinely did. But understanding wasn't the same as buying. Inside a pawn shop, uncertainty carries financial risk. Rick wasn't purchasing a possibility. He was investing real money. And real money demands certainty. The conversation gradually shifted from authentication toward valuation. The expert referenced comparable auction sales, recent market trends, condition reports, original hardware, finish quality. Every measurable factor pushed the instrument into an exceptionally valuable category. Without verified celebrity provenance, however, there remained a ceiling. That ceiling sat far below $1 million. Rick folded his hands. "You've got an incredible guitar," he said. "No question about that." Then came the offer. $250,000. It wasn't meant to insult. It wasn't designed to exploit the seller. It reflected exactly what Rick believed he could responsibly risk based on documented facts. The seller listened politely. Then he shook his head. No, there wasn't anger, only certainty. For more than 30 years, he had believed this guitar carried a story larger than anyone had yet managed to prove. He wasn't prepared to abandon that belief because the paperwork remained incomplete. Rick increased his offer. The seller barely moved. Rick explained the realities of resale, insurance, auction uncertainty, capital tied up in inventory. The seller responded with history rather than finance. He spoke about the musicians he'd known, about touring life, about how instruments often changed hands informally between artists, technicians, and trusted friends. Not every important moment generated paperwork. Some survived only because someone remembered. The discussion continued for more than half an hour. Numbers moved. Arguments evolved. Respect never disappeared. Neither man questioned the other's integrity. They simply valued uncertainty differently. Rick believed uncertainty reduced value. The seller believed uncertainty delayed recognition. There is a profound difference between those two ideas. And perhaps that's why this negotiation continues to fascinate people years later. It wasn't a battle between honesty and deception. It was a collision between two philosophies. One built around documented certainty, the other built around accumulated probability. If you had been standing behind that counter, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the guaranteed money? Or would you have trusted your instincts and walked away, believing that history simply needed more time to reveal itself? Tell us your answer in the comments before we continue, because what happened after this meeting would change the entire story in ways nobody inside that pawn shop could have predicted. Eventually, Rick made what would become his final position. $310,000. A substantial increase. One that reflected both the rarity of the guitar and the seriousness with which he viewed the opportunity. The seller remained silent for several long seconds. He looked down at the Les Paul resting quietly between them. Then he closed the guitar case with the same care he'd shown when he first walked through the door. "No," he said softly. "I think I'll keep looking." There was no dramatic exit. No slammed door. No raised voices. Just one man lifting a weathered guitar case and walking away with something that, in his mind, remained priceless. Not because of what had already been proven, but because of what he believed the future would eventually uncover.